They say the air grows colder when he arrives. Not just a chill that brushes your skin, but a deep, biting cold that seeps into your bones. A silent warning. It doesn't matter if you're in the chaos of a crumbling building or the stillness of a hospital room. When El Señor de los Milagros appears, miracles happen. But so does death. For centuries, this mysterious figure has haunted the collective memory of a small, isolated town tucked deep in the Andes. To the faithful, he is a protector, a savior sent by God to shield them from disasters that seem to strike with unnerving precision. Earthquakes that split the earth open. Landslides that bury entire villages. Fires that consume homes in the dead of night. Witnesses speak of a shadowed figure appearing in the midst of these catastrophes, his face shrouded by a hood, his hands stretched out as if to guide the living through the chaos. But not everyone sees him as a blessing. For every life he spares, there are whispers of a terrible price. Those who claim to have seen his face often vanish shortly after. Families left untouched by disaster find themselves cursed in inexplicable ways. Children fall ill with no cure in sight, livestock dies overnight, and dreams are haunted by visions too horrific to describe. El Señor de los Milagros, the Lord of Miracles. Savior to some, harbinger of doom to others. The first known account of his appearance dates back to the 17th century, during a devastating earthquake that reduced much of Lima, Peru to rubble. Survivors huddled in terror as the ground shook violently beneath their feet, their prayers drowned out by the deafening roar of collapsing buildings. Yet, amidst the destruction, one wall remained standing, a mural depicting a dark, robed figure with his arms outstretched, as if shielding the land itself. They called it a miracle, and the legend was born. Over the centuries, stories of his intervention spread beyond Peru, taking on new forms in other regions. In one village, he was said to have walked through the flames of a burning church, saving a priest trapped inside. In another, he appeared on a mountaintop during a landslide, guiding a group of children to safety. Each tale carried the same chilling detail. His presence was always followed by death. The faithful erected shrines in his honor, lighting candles and offering prayers to ward off his darker side. His image became a symbol of hope for some and a warning for others. And yet, no amount of faith could erase the fear that lingered. Because his arrival was never predictable. You didn't summon him. You didn't choose him. He chose you. Perhaps it was your cries for help, your whispered prayers in the face of despair. Or perhaps it was something darker, a fate written long before the disaster struck, an inescapable thread that tied you to him. What made his legend truly terrifying was not just his power to save but the uncertainty of what came after. Survivors often spoke of feeling marked, as if his gaze had left an invisible imprint on their souls. Some described vivid dreams of him standing at their bedside, his eyes burning like embers beneath his hood. Others found symbols carved into their walls, symbols they couldn't understand but instinctively feared. What would you do if you saw him? Would you fall to your knees, grateful for his mercy, or would you run, knowing the cost of his intervention? This is not a story of faith alone, nor is it one of pure horror. It's a story of duality, of a figure that walks the razor's edge between salvation and destruction. To this day the question remains unanswered. Is he a blessing or is he a curse? As the candles flicker and the shadows dance on your walls, remember this: El Señor de los Milagros watches from the darkness. And when he comes, you'll never be the same again. I was 7 years old when I first heard about him. It was during one of those sticky summer nights when sleep felt impossible, and the world outside our little house in the mountains seemed to buzz with a life of its own. My grandmother, Abuela Rosa, sat by the dim glow of a single candle, her gnarled fingers working a set of rosary beads like her life depended on it. Her voice, low and gravelly, broke the silence. "Do you know why we light candles, mi Nina?" I shook my head, captivated by her tone, the way her words seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on the still air. "It's so he can see us," she said, her eyes flicking to the shadows that danced on the walls. "El Señor de los Milagros. When he comes, you mustn't be caught in the dark." She leaned in then, her face lit eerily by the flickering flame, and began to tell me the stories. Stories of disasters, earthquakes, floods, fires, where death swept through like an unstoppable tide. But always there was him, the dark figure in the chaos, pulling people from the brink of certain death. At first it sounded like a tale of salvation, but her tone shifted. "His mercy," she whispered, "is never free." That night I barely slept. My room was small, its single window offering a view of the old bell tower that loomed over our town. I kept staring at it, half expecting to see a shadow move against the stone. The next morning I asked Abuela more about him. She told me to hush, warning that to speak his name too often was to invite his attention. But she couldn't resist adding one last piece. Your great-grandfather saw him once. That was the first time I'd heard of my great-grandfather's story. According to Abuela, he had been a young man when a fire broke out in the town square during a festival. The flames spread fast, trapping dozens of people. Just as it seemed hopeless, my great-grandfather claimed to see a figure walking through the inferno. He described him as tall, cloaked in black, with hands that seemed to glow faintly like embers. The figure pointed to a narrow alley no one had noticed before. My great-grandfather led a group of survivors through it, emerging unscathed on the other side. But Abuela's face darkened as she recounted what followed. Weeks later, strange things began to happen. My great-grandfather grew paranoid, speaking of symbols carved into trees near his home and strange shadows following him at night. One morning, he was found dead in his bed, his face frozen in an expression of terror. It's not just what he saves you from, Abuela warned me, gripping her rosary tighter. It's what he takes in return. Years passed, and the story faded into the background of my life. It became one of those strange family tales you think about only in passing. That is, until the day I saw him for myself. It was during the Festival of the Crosses, a celebration that lit up our little town with music, dancing, and endless processions. I was 16, wandering the crowded streets with my best friend, Anna, when we stumbled into a tent displaying religious artifacts. There, in the corner, hung a painting. I recognized it immediately, the dark figure, cloaked in black, standing amidst a raging fire. His hands were raised, glowing faintly, just as Abuela had described. The plaque beneath it read, El Señor de los Milagros. Anna laughed it off, calling it a creepy old painting. But as I stared at it, my heart pounded in my chest. The figures had seemed deeper than mere paint could allow, as though it stretched into some endless void. And then I saw it, just for a moment but long enough to make my blood run cold. The faint outline of his hand seemed to move, shifting toward me. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a display table. Anna grabbed my arm, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the painting, now perfectly still, and feel the weight of Abuela's words echoing in my mind. He sees you. It happened on a night when the air felt heavy, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Rain pounded against the rooftops, turning the cobblestone streets into rivers of mud. I was at the old community theater, helping Anna with decorations for an upcoming festival. The building was ancient, its walls thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. Most of the others had gone home hours earlier, leaving just the two of us to finish. We were stringing lights along the balcony railings when it began. A low rumble, almost imperceptible at first, like a distant growl from the earth itself. I paused, my hands gripping the cold metal, and glanced at Anna. She froze too, her face pale in the flickering light. The rumble grew louder, shaking the ground beneath our feet. The lights above us swayed violently, some flickering out. It took a moment for reality to hit. It wasn't just thunder. It was an earthquake. Run! Anna screamed, grabbing my wrist. We bolted toward the stairs, the walls around us groaning under the strain. Dust and debris rained down as the building shuddered. By the time we reached the main floor, the chandelier in the center of the auditorium had already crashed to the ground, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. The exit was just a few steps away when the ceiling gave a deafening crack. I looked up in time to see a massive beam breaking loose, falling straight toward us. My body froze, my legs refusing to move. And then I saw him. A figure cloaked in black, standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm outside. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his presence was undeniable, commanding, unearthly. His hand rose slowly and pointed toward a narrow side door we hadn't noticed before. Anna yanked me out of my stupor, pulling me toward the door. The beam crashed behind us with a force that shook the ground, splintering into pieces. We stumbled out into the rain, gasping for air, just as the entire building collapsed in on itself. We weren't alone. A handful of others had escaped through the side door, their faces ashen and streaked with dirt. Someone muttered a prayer, their voice trembling. He was there, an older man whispered, clutching a small wooden cross. El Señor de los Milagros. He saved us. I didn't respond. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing to process what I had seen. The figure in the doorway. The hand pointing to the exit. It couldn't have been real, could it? But as the rain continued to pour, something else caught my attention. A woman beside me let out a sharp gasp, staring at her arm. "What is this?" she cried, holding it out for everyone to see. A faint, dark mark was etched into her skin, a series of lines and curves that formed an unfamiliar symbol. One by one, the others began checking themselves. On their hands, their arms, even their necks, the same strange mark appeared. My stomach churned as I lifted the sleeve of my jacket. There it was, just below my wrist. A symbol burned into my skin like a shadow. What does it mean? Anna asked, her voice shaking. The old man crossed himself, his eyes wide with fear. It means we've been marked. Marked for what? I demanded, my voice rising above the rain. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fear in his eyes said it all. I looked back toward the ruins of the theater, hoping for one last glimpse of the figure in the doorway. But the street was empty, the storm swallowing everything in its path. That night, the whispers began. People claimed to have seen him before the quake, standing at the edge of town. Some called him a savior. Others warned that his miracles always came with a price. And as I lay awake in bed, staring at the symbol on my wrist, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were right. Whatever he had saved us from, it wasn't over. The days after the earthquake passed in a strange haze. The entire town was in mourning for those who hadn't made it out of the theater and the other buildings that had collapsed. Yet amidst the grief, there was an undercurrent of awe, whispers of the cloaked figure who had guided a lucky few to safety. Some hailed it as a miracle. Others avoided speaking of it altogether, as though even mentioning his presence might invite something darker. At first, I thought the worst was behind us. The symbol burned into my wrist. A faint, swirling mark had faded slightly, though it never disappeared completely. Anna joked that we should think of it as a badge of survival, but I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. The first death came 3 days later. It was the older man who had clutched his cross so tightly the night of the earthquake. His body was found in his home, seated in an armchair. There were no signs of struggle, no visible wounds. The only clue was the look on his face, his eyes wide, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. The doctor ruled it a heart attack, but the murmurs around town said otherwise. He was marked, someone whispered at the funeral, their eyes darting to the faint symbol on my wrist. By the end of the week, there were 2 more. A young woman who had been part of the escape was discovered in her bed, her body cold and lifeless, though she had been perfectly healthy the day before. Then one of the theater technicians, found at the edge of town, his truck crashed into a tree. The strange thing? His injuries didn't match the crash. It was as if something had crushed him, but there was nothing in the wreckage to suggest how. Each death brought with it a growing dread. Those of us who had escaped that night began to avoid one another, as though proximity might spread whatever curse we carried. The symbol on my wrist, once faint, started to darken again. I found myself pulling my sleeves down more often, unwilling to see the mark that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Then came the signs. At first they were small. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, fleeting glimpses of something, or someone, out of the corner of my eye. One night as I walked home from Anna's house, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but the street behind me was empty, lit only by the dim glow of the street lamps. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The dream started soon after. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the image of the cloaked figure burned into my mind. In the dreams, he stood at the foot of my bed, silent and unmoving, his hood an endless void. When I reached out to touch him, his hand would rise, and I would wake just before it made contact. One night, I noticed something chilling. The symbol on my wrist wasn't just darkening, it was changing. The lines and curves seemed to shift, as though forming a new pattern I couldn't yet decipher. I rubbed at it furiously, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but it remained stubbornly etched into my skin. I started noticing other things too. A faint smell of smoke that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The distant tolling of a bell, though the town's old bell tower had been silent for years. The unease grew into something heavier, something I couldn't ignore. Every time I walked past a mirror, I felt the urge to look away, afraid I might see something, or someone, standing behind me. Anna noticed my unease and tried to comfort me, but even she couldn't ignore the pattern. They were all marked, she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. The ones who died. They all had it. She didn't need to explain what it was. We both knew. I wanted to believe that I could escape it, that the deaths were just a string of coincidences. But deep down I knew better. The mark wasn't a badge of survival. It was a promise, a debt waiting to be collected. And I could feel the clock ticking. By the second week, the fear had become unbearable. I couldn't walk through town without feeling the weight of the villagers' stares, their whispers chasing me like ghosts. Everyone seemed to know what I was trying to deny. Something was coming for me. And it wouldn't stop until it claimed me just as it had claimed the others. It was Anna who convinced me to dig deeper. "You can't just wait around for whatever this is," she said one evening, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to find out what's happening to you." So we began our search. It started innocently enough in the town library. The shelves were dusty, the books older than most of the buildings still standing after the quake. At first, there was nothing but vague references to El Señor de los Milagros, mentions of his role as a protector, a savior who appeared in times of catastrophe. But then, in a forgotten corner of the archives, we found something darker. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded, written by a priest who had served in the region centuries ago. The entries were filled with accounts of miraculous rescues during earthquakes, fires, and floods, always attributed to the cloaked figure. But the tone of the entries shifted as we read on. The priest wrote of survivors falling ill, their bodies wasting away without explanation. Others vanished entirely, their fates unknown. One entry, dated in the late 1700s, chilled me to my core. They call him a savior, but they do not see the truth. His aid is not a blessing but a bargain. Those marked by his hand carry a debt that must be paid in full. And payment, it seems, is always made in blood. Anna looked up at me, her face pale. "A bargain," she whispered. "That's what the mark is, isn't it? A contract." The more we read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Stories from different centuries across different towns, all telling the same tale. Disasters followed by miraculous escapes and then death. Always the deaths. We learned of an ancient legend that predated the Catholic veneration of El Señor de los Milagros. The cloaked figure, it seemed, was tied to an older belief, a being summoned in times of desperation. According to the journal, long ago, a village struck by famine had made a desperate plea to this entity, offering their eternal servitude in exchange for salvation. The famine ended, but the price of their plea echoed through time, binding their descendants to the figure's will. "What if this isn't just a legend?" Anna asked, her voice barely audible. "What if you're—" She hesitated, as if speaking it aloud might make it true. "What if you're part of this curse?" I wanted to dismiss her, to call her crazy, but the evidence was undeniable. My family had lived in this region for generations. The stories of El Señor de los Milagros had been passed down like heirlooms, always told with reverence. But now, I could see the fear hidden beneath the words. And then there were the signs. The bell I kept hearing, though no one else did. The smoke that lingered in my clothes, even when I hadn't been near a fire. The mark on my wrist, which now felt hot to the touch, as though it pulsed with its own heartbeat. The journal's final entry offered one last clue, scrawled hastily in ink that had smeared with age. To break the bond, one must face him. But none have returned to tell how. Face him? Anna repeated, her eyes wide. How are you supposed to do that? And what happens if you fail? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that my time was running out. That night, as I walked home, the signs grew more intense. The bell was louder, the smell of smoke thicker. And then I saw it, a shadow moving ahead of me despite there being no one there. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. He wasn't waiting for me to find him. He was already here. The night it happened, the air felt impossibly still. Not a single sound disturbed the quiet, not the rustle of leaves, not the distant hum of traffic. Even the crickets, so reliable in their nightly song, had fallen silent. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, heavy and unnatural. I had stayed up late, poring over the priest's journal once more, trying to piece together fragments of a plan. But there was no plan. Just cryptic warnings, half-forgotten rituals, and vague accounts of people who tried to face him, and never returned. I don't know what compelled me to step outside. Maybe it was the lingering smell of smoke that had grown too strong to ignore, or the distant toll of the phantom bell, louder now, ringing out like a summons. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out, my pulse racing. The streets were deserted, bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow from the streetlights that flickered as I passed. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and shifting like they had a will of their own. I walked, not entirely sure where I was going, until I reached the edge of town, the remains of the theater. The rubble still lay in jagged piles, a haunting monument to the disaster that had brought him to us. And there, in the center of the ruins, I saw him. El Señor de los Milagros. He stood motionless, his form shrouded in a heavy, dark cloak that seemed to swallow the light around him. His hood was drawn low, obscuring his face, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. It wasn't just sight, it was as if he saw through me, peeling back the layers of my being until nothing was hidden. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The flashlight slipped from my trembling hand, its beam landing on the ground and casting long, jagged shadows that only made him seem larger, more imposing. His presence was overwhelming, an impossible blend of divinity and menace. He radiated power, both awe-inspiring and terrifying, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I didn't. Somehow, I knew this was what the priest's journal had meant. To break the bond, I had to face him. My survival wasn't guaranteed, but fleeing wasn't an option. He had come for me and there was no escape. Slowly, he raised a hand and I saw it clearly for the first time. The skin, or what resembled skin, was cracked and glowing faintly as though molten fire ran beneath its surface. In his palm was the same symbol that now burned on my wrist, and as I looked down, I saw mine glowing in response. A voice, not spoken but felt, echoed in my mind. It was ancient and resonant, like the tolling of a great bell. You were chosen. I didn't know what he meant. Chosen for what? To live? To die? To pay some ancient debt forged by ancestors I'd never met? My heart pounded as I tried to find the courage to speak. Why? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Why me? Why any of us? He didn't answer, not in words. Instead, images flooded my mind, visions of disasters throughout history. Floods, fires, earthquakes. Every time there he was, saving a few, marking them, and then claiming them. But then something new. A choice. I realized what the priest's journal had failed to explain. It wasn't just about survival or death, it was about surrender. Those he marked were bound to him, not as victims but as witnesses. Their deaths were not random. They were sacrifices to maintain some balance, a pact forged in desperation centuries ago. You may leave, the voice intoned, and my mark burned hotter. The words were simple, but I understood their weight. I could walk away, but it would come at a price. The curse wouldn't stop. Someone else would take my place. Tears stung my eyes as I felt the crushing weight of the decision. It wasn't just my life. It was a choice between selfish survival and ending the cycle. And so, trembling, I stepped forward toward him, ready to decide. I took another step toward him, each movement feeling heavier than the last. The air around me seemed to ripple with an invisible force, pressing against my chest and pulling at my thoughts. El Señor de los Milagros stood unmoving, waiting. His silence was suffocating, yet it demanded more from me than any words ever could. My mind raced, torn between survival and sacrifice. The weight of the choice crushed me, and in that moment, I realized that my decision wasn't about understanding him, it was about trusting what little I knew of myself. I won't let anyone else take my place, I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. If this is my burden, I'll bear it. His head tilted slightly, almost as if in acknowledgement. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, he reached out. His hand hovered inches from my mark, and an unbearable heat surged through my wrist, spreading like wildfire through my veins. The pain was excruciating, yet I couldn't pull away. As I gasped for breath, flashes of light filled my vision. I saw more than I could comprehend, fractures in time, glimpses of other disasters, other faces, other lives. Each one carried the same mark, each one caught in the same impossible choice. It wasn't just my town. It wasn't just me. This was something far greater, stretching across centuries, binding him to us, and us to him. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. I collapsed to my knees, trembling, the world around me spinning. When I looked up, he was gone. The ruins were silent again, the smell of smoke dissipating like a forgotten dream. My wrist was bare, the mark no longer visible. For a moment I thought it was over. But then I noticed something, a single faint bell tolling in the distance. My heart sank. The days that followed were strange, almost surreal. People in the town whispered about the disaster and the figure they had seen among the flames. Some claimed he had saved them. Others said they had felt his gaze and knew he had marked them. No one asked about me directly, but their glances told me everything. They knew I had seen him too. At first, I thought I had been spared, that my decision had broken the cycle. But then the dreams began. Every night I saw him. His cloaked figure stood in the distance, watching, waiting. The visions were never the same. Sometimes I saw his hand outstretched, glowing with that molten light. Other times, I heard the bell growing louder and louder, echoing in my mind long after I woke. And then there were the others. Anna was the first to notice. It's like, they've disappeared, she said one day, her voice shaking. She was talking about the survivors. The ones who had been pulled from the rubble alongside me. They were vanishing one by one without a trace. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty homes, their belongings untouched. As if they had been plucked from existence. That's when I realized the truth. I hadn't ended the cycle. I had only delayed it. Whatever bargain had been struck centuries ago, it wasn't mine to break. And now I was different. The mark on my wrist was gone, but I felt its presence beneath my skin, deeper than before. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, somehow I had been changed. Tethered to him in a way I didn't yet understand. The last time I saw him was 3 nights ago. I woke to the sound of the bell, louder than it had ever been, as though it was ringing directly above my house. When I looked out the window, he was there, standing in the shadows. This time he didn't move. He didn't speak. But I felt his message as clearly as if he had whispered it into my ear. This is not the end. And then he was gone. Now I wait, unsure of what's coming next. The town has returned to a fragile normalcy, but I know better. The others are still disappearing. The bell still rings in the distance. I don't know if he'll return for me or if I'll become something else entirely, part of the legend, part of the curse. All I know is that he is still out there watching. And when disaster strikes again, so will he.